we enjoyed doing the protagonist one, didn't we? Where it was kind of a bit more almost list based in a way, as much as you can write a list for sort of our idea of what we want for the show. And this time we're going with 1990s, not 1890s. That's a bit too far back, and 1790s is even further. So we'll not do that. We're doing 1990s.
Definitely. And before we jump fully in, I will quickly mention as well. Thank you all for the response to the antagonist episode. It wasn't a definitive list. What we do today isn't a definitive list, and if you want to throw in your options for the antagonists or for what we talk about today, comment on YouTube, comment on Instagram, DRH Pod everywhere. Yeah. If you want to rate and review us while you're on podcast apps, that'd be nice as well. Just saying. Yeah. We're all right. There's a bit of work in this,
Help us grow the community. Yeah. You seemed way more natural than when I did it. Or were you actually cringing on the inside doing that then?
Oh yeah. But if gave myself abs, I was that tense. But no, we're a ways off that yet. Don't worry.
Okay. Like you said about the definitive list, this isn't a definitive list at all. Yeah. Sometimes some of the ones that I'm going to mention in here are ones that I really loved, or something that sparks an idea about particular things that were going on in the 90s, or they represent a certain type of property that aren't necessarily around anymore or have developed or changed. They're more almost like the beginning inception points of a topic, or like I said, it could be just something that I really loved. I'm going to start with probably action films within the 90s. And something that's very close to our heart is comic books. And a lot of people forget The Crow. The Crow is a comic book film. The art style between the comic book and the film, very, very different. Even even the main character looks very different. He's almost got like a bit of a sort of 80s mullety sort of thing going on. But I loved that film. When in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, I was a very much like grungy. Like the long hair's come back in recent years, but like I was going for like a Kurt Cobain look. Unfortunately, it definitely segued into Hanson. No, that's a bad look. But if you're going for one to end up as the other, that's a different thing. And I think the soundtrack in The Crow is amazing. You got like Nine Inch Nails, are in it. The Cure, the whole aesthetic of it was really cool. And then the more you look into the film, the Crow, and behind the scenes, Brandon Lee was the main character, Eric Draven. He's the son of Bruce Lee.
Might have heard of him.
Yeah, he did a couple of things. And he died making the film. Then his dad died while he was making the film. And the conspiracy of like his dad died when he was making the film that was going to make him a breakout, amazing big star. Brandon, similar sort of thing happened, and it all goes into the conspiracy theory around it, and in a very weird way, in a bit of a grim way, it actually ends up hyping up the movie.
It helps the film almost.
Yeah,
which of all the ways to do so is the last thing you'd want, really. Yeah,
because the actor who was actually responsible for killing him, basically, it was supposed to be a blank bullet. And I didn't realise this, but maybe I'm wrong, but the way that it's told in documentaries I've seen is that all blanks are made from real bullets, and it wasn't blanked enough. So the actor
I think it's basically how much gunpowder or whatever makes a bullet lethal, where it will pierce skin and penetrate you. There's less in a blank, I believe. And
it took years of counselling for the actor to get over what he did or was part of. And like, I don't think anyone out there is thinking like, he's responsible for it. But the difference between how you feel about something and what the actual nuts and bolts facts are very, very different. But going back to the film, I think it's a really good film. There's some questionable CGI in it, but that's based on the time.
Yeah.
They were using the CGI to copy and paste Brandon Lee from earlier footage so that they could complete the film. There's an argument to be made that not having Brandon Lee in certain scenes changed the tone of the film, made it very darker, a lot shadowier, if that's a word or a term. So they basically drew in shadows, which made it look almost more comic book like. He became this sort of darker silhouetted character in the background and stuff, and
made him more ethereal and magical within the context of the film.
I love it. I mean, there's always been, I think since it was made, there's always been talk of doing a new Crow film. I know that Jason Momoa has been more recently attached to it. Bradley Cooper was attached to it at one point.
Not my first two choices for it, but bankable stars. They both make choices. They both commit to roles quite. And
when they were making The Crow, the same reaction was given to Brandon Lee taking on the role. So I really love the film, and it'll always have a very special place in my heart, because I thought of myself as quite a dark, brooding character. I wasn't. But I thought of myself as that, and it really lined up aesthetically with the sort of stuff that I really liked. And again, I've gone back to it, but that soundtrack is just so cool.
Yeah. There's certain films that this is slightly off topic, so if this doesn't make it in, I won't be offended. But there's certain films.
I mean, it's on brand for the podcast, though, dude. So
there's certain films where the quality, the soundtrack almost becomes better than the film, or at least lives longer or has a second life. So the Daredevil film, the Ben Affleck one, which people hate, I don't hate it. It's a guilty pleasure. There's certain bits in it that I love, and don't get me wrong, it's definitely not on par with The Crow or other more artistically driven films. And the soundtrack, a bit like The Crow, there's one frame of mind of it's kind of dated, it's very of the time, it's very much a sound of like a stamp of that moment.
Yeah.
But that's not always a bad thing. It's quite nice to have almost a time capsule of, even if this wasn't the mainstream at the time, this was a movement, this was a a group, like a wave at the time, and there's something about that where it's like certain films just. It'd be nice to think that this soundtrack's so good that maybe more people will give it a watch and revisit it based on that. Do you know what I mean?
Actually, I was thinking the way we did this would we do one each back and forward. But if you don't mind, based on talking about music,
go on.
My other one would be The Matrix. Now I love The Matrix. I think even now that crazy story, I think it would still make people think now about what's going on. I if you've seen it, like obviously you know the story, and you rewatch it, and there's always going to be those extra little bits that you didn't pick up on the first time. But I think if it came out brand new today, I think it would still be as not shocking, but it'd make people question still now. But that soundtrack
after a pandemic and people not agreeing with lockdowns, not agreeing with or not fully understanding the science, and sometimes the science being quite contradictory, you would start to think, hang on a minute, is any of this real?
Yes.
And that's not to disparage, there are victims out there and I get all that, but just that thing of people are already starting to question things a bit and start to get a little bit confused and a little bit, and The Matrix would tap into that thing of, like you say, of like, I'm starting to get, the walls are closing in a bit and it feels like a weird dream. And that's the whole
and I think what kind of backs up our feelings towards that is that there is a new Matrix film coming out. It's already in pre-production. It's not even like, the Wazowskis are thinking about doing it. It's like no, we're far enough down the line now that it's happening. But I remember I watched The Matrix on VHS at a sleepover at a mate's house. Never heard of it. And we were like, should we watch this? And The Matrix is such a good film that you shouldn't be watching it at a party. Like, this should be a sort of sit-down popcorn. This is the way I want to watch a movie. Go. But watch it at a party. And I was almost like, no, shut up. Leave me alone. What is going on here? This is... It changed me. Came out as a different person afterwards. Like, people are like, are you all right, Charlie? I was like, there is no spoon. There is no... Was there ever a spoon? What is a spoon?
And that was the last time his parents let him stay at that person's house.
But yeah, I love the aesthetic of it. I love how it's even. You could do video essay after video essay regarding the Matrix. How even the filters that they use between the Matrix world and the real world, and the stuff that they play with. You know, the reflections in Morpheus's glasses to reveal the red pill and the blue pill, and then going back and going, that was actually real, and that's in that person's head. Like the mirror when it takes over Neo, you will assume that that's just his mind going nuts, but actually that's what they saw, because so early on he's actually already be able to manipulate the Matrix on a passive level rather than an active level. And there's so much going on. And then I think in an adolescent mind, things like deja vu, like the cat going across twice. Well, we've all experienced deja vu. So if I experience deja vu, and in the film The Matrix deja vu is real, and it means that you're in a program, does that mean I'm in a program?
Yeah.
And
in lockdown, there's a lot of deja vu, because these four walls are getting pretty familiar at the moment. Another thing of it is as relevant. There's a lot of films and a lot of quite thought-provoking films out there that you could say this applies to, but for The Matrix, and for the purpose of this discussion, it does perfectly fit that, as you say, of it is as solid now, at least in terms of the ideas it explores and the themes it wants to pursue. Don't get me wrong, the music's great, and the special effects hold up pretty well for the most part, but there's still those couple of moments where you go, okay, I can see how pop culture's about to change after this.
Yeah, of course.
But even so, it's even fun to watch it with that in mind of, this feels derivative, but actually most things are derivative of this, which is why it feels so familiar and
I think
out.
It leans into the time period as well, like with the mobile phone, like the, you know, it flipping down and stuff. Whereas you could make the argument that if you want your film or your property to exist outside of its own time period, then maybe make the technology or make the references a little bit more generic, or don't have such time-stamped references. Whereas in The Matrix, they almost lean into it like full fat, like.
Yeah,
and I think it's richer for it, because there's way more grounding and more depth to it. And then I think the fact that the more you make the world inside the Matrix of a specific time period, the juxtaposition between outside of the Matrix and being in the future, it's a bigger, stronger divide almost.
Yeah, definitely, and especially at the time, it really gave it that level of. Although in the Matrix, like you say, there's filters and there's little things that make it less real. At least the just the pure basic look of the world, they wanted it to be very real for the time, so that audiences would be like, "Oh, this could just be the city that I live in."
Yeah.
Albeit with a green hue and odd reflective stuff, but this really could be just the time that we're in. And maybe it isn't actually real. How real is real and all that.
Well, I mean, it's the more you look into it, like I said about the video essay thing, like the raindrops on the windows, how you can find the pattern in the raindrops to suggest that, well, it's just a computer algorithm, isn't it, doing raindrops? Like the human eye would never see it.
Yeah.
But like on a computer game, like when the mapping of it, like you're gonna get those repeated like frames. The idea is that you do it randomly enough that it hides it. But in the Matrix, like, we'll lean into that, because that's how a computer works.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know I've done two back to back, but I felt like the music, because Rage Against the Machine in the Matrix was just, I was a massive fan. I still am. I was a big fan of Rage anyway, and then to see them in the Matrix, I was like, oh yeah, this is my boys in here. Yeah. Loved it. So anyway, go ahead, give us some of yours.
Yeah, go on. Slightly less intellectual maybe, but still good sci-fi themes for me. Terminator 2 Judgment Day is a big standout for the 90s.
It's on the list.
We touched on it recently on the Antagonist episode, but it's one of those few sequels out there which almost perfectly acts both against and alongside the original, as in we take the great star of the first one and go, do you know how scary and menacing one is the villain? Well, now he's the good guy. He's still going to play into some of those same character elements, but with a layer of purposely forced humanity. Like, I think Cameron knew that Arnie at the time, his acting ability, if he was really trying to play funny, cool, human guy, maybe a little limited still at the time, but he could definitely lean into his awkward, big brutishness of, there's something quite charming about seeing someone who's clearly very big and strong and robotic, who is trying to be human.
Yeah.
Robert Patrick as, again, taking some of those elements that work from the first one, but doing something totally different with it, really leaning into the charisma in the human moments, and the imitating human moments. And that idea of, he doesn't look as big and physically strong as the original Terminator, but this is different. This guy is all about blades and movement and speed. It's less about this slow-moving, constant enemy, and more, he'll run at you. It's like that jump from in zombie films from the slow walkers to the runners.
Oh, yeah.
It's that same thing of, you can't always just about get away, because this guy will run and, with the blade arms and jump on the back of the car and
sinister. I mean, if you want to see two grown men fanboy over the T800 and the T1000, go and watch or listen to the previous a couple of episodes ago. But I mean, we're massive fans of not just the franchise, but the actors and the portrayal that they nail in those films.
And I actually think, in terms of sort of pop culture references and other shows, other films, especially like comedically, like Simpsons and things, referencing, people always say the Terminator, or they'll say Terminator, and they don't mean the first film. For the most part, they mean the second one.
Yeah.
Because Arnie has been a good Terminator way more than bad at this point. And the thing from the first film that people reference is the I'll be back and the car through the wall, and that one moment in the first film, which, great, fine. But there's so many more references of Robert Patrick Terminator running and jumping on the car. Like, again, The Simpsons, I know they reference everything. I always think it's Homer has golf clubs and he's running after a car and he clips onto the back. There's loads of comedic references to it from that, and it perfectly balances. There's a few films I wrote down that we might not get to them all, but it's a bit of a genre mashup as well. Again, first Terminator film is, on the surface, it's a sci-fi film, but it's actually a horror. It's actually a slasher or a monster movie. And then Terminator 2, it's a clear standout from the 90s, objectively. Ignore the fact that I absolutely love it a bit. On the surface, it's a sci-fi film. It's about time travel, cyborgs, and blah, blah, blah. But it's actually a really good action thriller. Yeah. And in some ways a bit of a... It gets to the point of being like a conspiracy thriller, where you've got... at this point, Linda Hamilton's Sarah Connor is in a mental institution. I don't know what the correct term is now for that establishment, but basically a hospital. She's been hospitalised, and they're saying she needs medicating, and she's spouting all these ideas, and there's just as much about her trying to convince people she's not crazy. You know what, I'm going to get her son back.
Yeah, I'm going to hate myself for this, and I'll pop it up as in the edit, the actor's name. But the guy who plays her doctor in T2. You just want to punch him in the face. He smashes it, doesn't he? He's so good.
Yeah.
And clearly shown that he would, get destroyed by Linda Hamilton, by Sarah Connor, if she wanted to. But he just represents that, that administrator who's...
the smarmy, douchey guy who thinks he's better than everyone because he's got a degree.
Dude, she's trying to save the world, and you're worried about...
Don't you realise we as the audience know?
Yeah, come on! But he's great. He's great in it.
Yeah.
I've got a honourable mention already, because I feel like we don't... Is there a lot to say about it that hasn't already been said? But Jurassic Park, I just think, I just remember being in the cinemas and watching it and just being like, this is insane, this. I like dinosaurs as well. So watching Jurassic Park, it was a mate's birthday that we went to.
Yeah.
It was me, him, and then his parents went to see Jurassic Park, and it was one of those... I mean, I'm saying it's one of those moments. It obviously is. I'm talking about it now. I remember going to the cinema and seeing it, and it was that different. I was like, I didn't think films like this existed. I don't think this was able to be like to be done with a mixture of practical effects, but heavily, CGI, but in the best possible way, where they would put the dinosaur behind like a tree so you wouldn't see it connecting with the floor, and it was meant to be in the background so it was slightly out of focus. But then there was the practical effects with the eggs and the puppets coming out of the eggs and stuff in the incubators and that. But I remember thinking when we were going to do this list, going, "Oh God, there's some absolute shite in the '90s," and yeah, there was. But you know what? There's shite in every year, in every decade, or every time period you want to take a snapshot of. But Jurassic Park was a definite game changer.
Yeah,
it really showed what could be done.
I know exactly what you mean as well, because it was a game changer for the industry in terms of how good special effects could look. Because you watch the first Jurassic Park film, especially now, and so much of it still looks great. There'll be a couple of frames, a couple of bits that look a bit dodgy.
Yeah.
The only one that in my mind sticks out when I've watched it in recent years of going, oh, okay, I think is that big reveal of Sam Neill looking out, and there's loads of dinosaurs out across the hills, across the meadows of fields, and it's all just pure CGI, and it's like a big thing. And it doesn't look, it doesn't look terrible. But again, you go, oh, okay. But like you say, so much of it is big puppets, animatronics, practical.
But that scene in particular, I think, yes, okay, the reveal would be better if it was done now. But I would say the actual reveal is I was already bought into the emotion just based off Sam Neill's reaction that you can't see. Yeah. He almost sells how epic it is.
Yeah.
And almost like a bit of a trick of not editing, but a trick of cinematography, a trick of directing, is that as an audience you get caught up on Sam Neill's wave of excitement. Yeah. And then it ends up pulling that through into the next questionable CGI'd scene.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's one of these things on the list that if I hadn't have thrown Jurassic Park in there, even if we didn't talk like 15 minutes about it, I feel like it would have been 90s without Jurassic Park being mentioned. That would feel a bit wrong. But it was a good honourable mention to throw on, because before we move on, it's for Terminator 2. That has the same thing of, this is right at the start of the 90s for Terminator, and they tried to be really revolutionary with some of the things they did, and it doesn't all hold up. No,
but there's some shots in it that you go, wow, that still looks really good, for what it is.
Yeah,
that still looks great. And again, the film is good enough, the acting performances are good enough that you buy into it, and you go, oh, I believe that character's scared of, this cartoon liquid silver watery thing coming at them with knife arms. It's like
this
I believe
this velociraptor, or this T-Rex jumping in or anything.
Must go faster. Yeah. Right, let me throw one in quickly, because I think this is going to be controversial, so let's just get it out there. This is my favourite Tarantino film,
right?
And a little bit later in the 90s. I think it's the only one that it's based, almost entirely on an existing story, existing property. It's not just him homaging stuff he likes and writing a story, but Jackie Brown.
I knew you were going to say that.
So, for me, this is the best Tarantino.
I would make the argument that it's the most un-Tarantino film.
Yeah,
in a way.
It's got those elements that he likes of somewhat awkward and clumsy dialogue or action, to the point where it's like, oh yeah, this is kind of how real life is. It's not all as slick as he writes some of his characters, but it's got enough of that in there. However, the story itself is a bit more streamlined than sometimes his is. There's a little more to it.
Yeah.
But it's that, again, soundtrack.
He's famous for already.
It. Yeah. It's a solid soundtrack. It's really, really good. Pam Grier was possibly my first love. I'm going to throw it out there. I would have been, how old would I have been at the time? 8 or 9, maybe 10 at a push. I think she was my first love. I'm not going to lie. Michael Keaton's in there doing a great.
Was he your second love?
Funny performance. Second love, yeah. Not even as Batman, just in this. This is one that shares a universe with another film, which I can't think. Michael Keaton plays the same detective or FBI agent in another film. But yeah, whatever
That's
it is.
going to kill me.
Yeah. I think it's another Elmore. Is it Elmore Leonard, the writer? Again, it'll be Charlie will add the title in post and call me.
Well,
an idiot.
I'll have to know. I've got no choice. He does this. He locks
Just
me
don't
in.
put it up. Then I look even more of an idiot. It's just me going, "Oh, there's a title there." Nothing.
I'll put the wrong thing up.
Yeah. If anything, it's not even on me. It's on you while I'm talking. So it'll look even worse. But yeah, Jackie Brown for me is just.
You said it's a bit of a weird, controversial choice or whatever, but I agree. I think it's a solid film. I think if anything, now you've said that, I always do this whenever we get these sort of lists or these topics we talk about. I come away from it going, oh yeah, I'm going to watch this one and then watch this one.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jackie Brown's going on the list now. That's definitely worth a rewatch.
Yeah. I don't have tons more to say about it. It's the ones that I'm picking out and will pick out are also ones that I've probably watched the most, where it might not be the best film of the 90s, because some of these you can argue there's an argument to be made, but obviously how do you quantify that? Yeah. But a lot of them are ones where I remember rewatching them the most. I remember getting the most out of them in terms of, I probably watched it a few times a year, a few times a month in some cases for some of them. And Jackie Brown was one of them where there was just something. The pacing's there, it's the dialogue's there, it's cool. It's just fun. It's just rewatchable.
Sometimes things just connect with you. Either like we were talking before we started recording, and there's that saying, and I think it's very prevalent at the moment, especially anyone who started a new job, is that you don't know what you don't know. But as a kid, you only know what you know. Like if your world is so tiny in comparison, that if you're given like this film, for you you might think it's like the biggest film ever, but you know what? It was like a B movie that no one really watched or anything. But your world's so small that it becomes this big part of it. There's a TV show that I didn't even really watch it as a kid, but I was aware of it. It's called Bernard's Watch. Now, it's a really niche thing. I'm not going to go into it. It's definitely an honourable mention. Basically, this little lad, I don't even think Bernard, the character, speaks in the show. It got revamped later on, but like that's for something else. And he basically finds a stopwatch, and every time he stops to watch, world pauses. And I remember even as a kid thinking, I need that. That would be great, because I was thinking, I'm gonna wind that clock on and see if it speeds time up, and wind it back and see if it rewinds time. He never did any of that, Bernard. You weren't thinking, lad. But yeah, I just thought it was a really, really cool concept, and I thought, you know what, I'd probably make it seem like I had powers or something rather than it was a watch. But I just love that idea that, if I could have anything, Bernard's watch would be a good one. But yeah,
no, let's dig in a little bit, because I've had conversations about this show where I think some people.
Oh, so you're aware of it, right?
Yeah,
okay, cool, right? Okay.
I spoke to people about it, and they're almost questioning, like, is this some weird, creepy thing that you're into, like. What, Lewis? What's the thing? And I think you made this up, but
it wasn't a fever dream. This is a real show.
What's the range on it? Is it the universe? Is it the planet? Is it localized to your area? I do remember some episodes where he would travel quite far after his pause time. So clearly, if it was a limited range, it was a decent amount. And like, did he have to ever like charge it up? Would it be that he could hit pause, but like, if you don't get done what you need to get done within an hour, everything's going to carry on. And if you happen to be stood in the middle of the road, the car's going to start moving. You know what I mean? Like,
well, what happens if he dropped it and it fell and hit the ground on the stop bit? Would we all just be paused indefinitely?
Yeah. And then would the people start aging? Is it like, is time paused purely from his perception, but they would still physically age? Or is it a case of reality is paused? We could write a really cool, really cool idea.
Bernard's watch comes back and it's like dark as hell. I remember one episode where he does a maths test and gets really high marks by pausing his watch, and he gets taken into the headmaster's office, and the headmaster's like, right, Bernard, you're a bit thick. How have you done this? And he gets given a sum, stops the time. Obviously, calculators don't work or anything like that.
Yeah.
So he walks over to a desk in the room and he takes a piece of paper, and the maths sum is dividing something. So he starts ripping up the paper, dividing it, and counting how many pieces he's got and stuff like that. Unpauses time, tells the headmaster the right answer. And the headmaster's like, oh, right, okay, maybe he does know how to do it. All right, see you later, Bernard. That's weird. Then the headmaster turns around, sees on his table loads of paper everywhere ripped up, and the headmaster's like, what's going on here? And I'm like, Bernard, you didn't even look after it. Like, you didn't tidy up after yourself. What are you doing, Bernard?
It's like a whole spin-off series of people starting to question reality, and it almost becomes like a horror film at that point. Of like,
It had a narrative, a narrator talking. So
Yeah,
when Bernard
yeah.
didn't speak, the narrator would go, Bernard answered 23, and Bernard, the little lad, would be just sat there going, right.
Yeah, it didn't.
I can't remember if anyone spoke or it was just in a narrator.
I was just gonna say, I seem to remember that being confused when I was a kid about like the use of dialogue or lack thereof. Was it all narration?
It actually made me question when I got older, was it like a Scandi film or a Scandi TV show that had been redone? A bit like, Magic Roundabout, how they just got the imagery and made up their own story. At least in Bernard's Watch, where they just just dubbing it almost, but rather than a weird dubbing that kids would find quite difficult, possibly.
We could Google all this, but let us know at home. Instagram.com/DRHpod, comments below. Tell us, just Google it, or,
So another TV show, it's just an honourable mention because I don't need to go into it because it's just too big on the zeitgeist, really, is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It was huge. I never got to watch it until it came on to, I think, BBC Two. At like 6 o'clock in the evening, but it was on Sky, and I remember people talking about it in school and just how amazing this show was, and I never got to experience it
until it was syndicated on.
Onto.
That's the same for me. That's exactly the same for me.
Yeah. Are we the same person? This would be weird.
I've actually rewatched that recently, or started to rewatch season 1 on Disney Plus.
It is getting a resurgence, isn't it? Now, like it's coming.
Yeah. It is one of those where. So, did you ever watch? And I think so. Buffy. So the series was 97, and I think the film that was also written by Whedon. In my mind, it's like this really dated 80s thing, but I actually think that was like 92 or 93, and it just wasn't particularly popular. I mean, popular enough that he got a series, licensed off the back of it and made. But the series isn't like, it's not a series based on what happens in that film, is it? It's a sequel.
The series is a
straight
sequel.
follow-up. Yeah.
I always thought it was like, they changed the cast and all this sort of stuff because
they've changed it. There's none of the same actors or anything like that, but it is Buffy from that film. And they. So when I rewatched the season open, because in my mind I always had this thing of like, oh, it must be like just a full reimagining or nothing to do with it.
That's what I always thought it was.
Yeah, but the season opener, Buffy basically references like, all that stuff that happened where the gym burnt down in the old school and all this, and you're like, oh, okay, so
that's weird.
So there's a link, and it's one of those where, if you want to pretend it's its own thing, you can do. You can enjoy it as its own series, or you can link the two together.
Yeah,
it is quite dated. A lot of the audio stings and sound effects and little jingles are what you hear in any editing suite that you've got now, iMovie and Final Draft. It's the stock sounds that you get as part of any editing suite. So. But again, it seems more dated because now they've all been used a lot.
Well, it's.
Do you know what I mean? It's this certain sounds, like this certain animal growls that they use to represent the vampires, which almost they were around at the time, but I feel like Buffy popularized a lot of editing choices, which then became almost comedy bits in other things to use those noises, and then like. Documentaries and factual shows would also then start using those audio stings, and then now you watch it and you're like, oh, does this take me out of it? Is it a bit too meta?
Is this a comedy bit now or something?
There's a lot more comedy in it, I remember, as well, which is nice. I mean, the jokes don't all land really well, some of them again are quite dated, but there's
a metal door squeak sound that's used a lot in that show that every time I hear it, it always takes me out. It's one of those things, once you hear it, you can't not hear it in everything.
Yeah.
But actually, it's funny, isn't it, that, with equal representation that, is really on the forefront of a lot of TV shows and films and comic books at the moment. I think it's taken a long time for it to come. Buffy, however, was doing that years ago, like having a lead. But then they lent into the fact that she was a beautiful young girl who you weren't expecting a lot from, and actually she was, arguably one of the, the strongest, toughest people on the planet.
Yeah, that's where I'm up to in the show. There's definitely still some question marks around. It's a similar thing to when we mentioned about Captain America, is that I know that in theory this character is like super strong, where like Captain America, if he kicked a normal human full force, it's not just like a UFC fighter kicking you, like a really strong person. It like being hit by a car. He could kill you. He could literally snap your face off. Yeah. And Buffy, in theory, has enhanced strength and things, because obviously the vampires, she can hit them back and things. But then every now and then, someone will hit her with something, or one of the vampires might hit a normal human character, and it just seems like someone's hit them quite hard. Yeah. And
like Xander takes a lot of hits, and he's still alive.
And he's us. He's the goofy, he's the goofy fun normal dude who's just trying to joke his way through. When you look into it, it's a pretty scary situation.
Yeah.
It definitely suffers a lot from possibly studio interference or channel interference.
Right.
There's definitely a lot of things where you think, I can see the creator's idea, I can see Whedon's vision and what he wanted starting to come through, and then let's temper it a little bit, let's bring it back in. But it's a fun show to rewatch.
At the time, I didn't like initially the vampire design. The fact that they almost go a bit feline like with the eyebrows going up and the
lots like
forehead.
Ridges on the head and all very
But now looking back, well, not even but now, but solely over time of watching the show when it got into syndication on Channel 2, I actually really liked the choice that they did. Almost like, they're not just like really good looking people who are on the prowl for blood and that. We've decided that we're going to make them a little bit more animalistic. Yeah. We're doing our own version of vampires, and I think that's one of the really good points about the show, is that it's not just a vampire show. It's like their own version of vampires in it.
Yeah,
and it was quite a dark show at times. Like there's some standout episodes that you go, whoa, that is pretty. Like those skeleton, the really gaunt guys who float around and don't speak, and it's really quiet. I can't remember the end of the episode, the name of the episode, but it's quite a well-known one.
It is essentially Scooby-Doo for adults.
And
that's not an original thought. There's plenty more intelligent people and more well-read people than me have made similar sort of arguments themselves. And I think Whedon himself has basically said before, I wanted to make Scooby-Doo for a modern generation, for teens or adults. But yeah, it definitely has that thing of, like you say, it will suddenly get very dark, or at least you could have a couple of quite fun Monster of the Weeks, and then all of a sudden you're like, in this episode, if Buffy doesn't win, the world's probably going to end, and by the way, a few characters are going to get killed off.
Yeah. Well, the Angel story arc, when about him being evil and then going good, and actually going good is when his life gets way worse and stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there.
All right, I've got a technically choice for TV, keeping it live action, because I've got 100 cartoons written down, and I had 2 live action. One of them being Buffy. The other is Star Trek: The Next Generation. Now, hear me out. The first 2 or 3 seasons are in the 80s, and you feel it. It's very 80s. It's very dated. I mean, it's even more dated than 80s. It's its own thing. By the 3rd season, I think the 3rd season came out in 89. I think I wrote down 89, but I scribbled it, so I can't tell. But season 4 is in 1990. And the last 2 or 3 seasons are when Star Trek, the Next Generation series really kicks up a gear. And you can actually... The aesthetic of the show, for the most part, is the same. It still looks like Star Trek: The Next Generation, but you notice the time period change and there's only 1 or 2 years between most seasons, but it's just funny that there's a show that I associate the first 2 seasons with the 80s, like I say, because it's clear, but from that point on, in my mind, it's a 90s show because I watched
it feels
very
90s to me.
Yeah, I watched it mostly in syndication, so similar to like Buffy and things. It'd be on BBC, for example, and I'd watch the reruns. So I'm probably watching it maybe a year or 2 after it came out, if not more.
If not more, yeah.
Yeah, but it also was alongside the resurgence of like the live action films for the Next Generation cast as well. So like First Contact came out in 96, for example. I think it was a couple of years after TNG had maybe finished, but in my mind a lot of that starts to blur and starts to come together. And obviously it led to Deep Space Nine, which is 93 or 94, so again numbers
Deep
and dates
Space Nine Deep Space Nine, that's my favourite Star Trek sort of show. I think it's just because it had another race in the forefront, and they weren't on a Federation. Well, they were on a Federation station, as in ownership technically.
Yeah. But it was in deep space.
But it was in deep space, and it was a design by a different race, so it looked very different from the 2 previous shows and stuff.
It was to a certain degree. It was the anti-Star Trek series. It was almost how do we make something that isn't as positive and optimistic and almost everyone's getting on. Star Trek is like the original woke progressive show. It was
that's what Gene Roddenberry envisioned for it. I know that like on Next Generation they had, was it called 10 Forward? Was it called the bar that they had in it where Whoopi Goldberg played Guinan? But they had like the bar on Deep Space Nine, but they were gambling and they had money, and it was the first time you'd really seen money transactions between characters, because you assume that the Federation, they've it's almost communism in a way, that they don't have like salaries or anything like that. So it is right. It is like within Star Trek, it is the most anti-Star Trek Star Trek.
Yeah, and it's still great, and I think Next Generation feels like the first time when it isn't just about the crew of the Enterprise, or it isn't just about. I don't know. I guess the universe feels bigger and more real in that series, and again, especially later on, and then that ties into the other series. Like Deep Space Nine is a direct spin-off from Next Generation. At least at the start, then it becomes very much its own thing, and there's a whole community of sci-fi lovers who only love Deep Space Nine or only follow that, or that's their favourite Star Trek.
Yeah. They bring a lot of spiritual stuff into Deep Space Nine, like Rebirth and not the Chosen One, but like isn't Cisco like the adversary? Not the adversary, the emissary. I think for the race and all this sort of stuff that comes into it, which is very, like you said, I think you summed it up quite brilliantly, like almost anti Star Trek sort of feels to it.
It just. Again, one that since TNG as well is another one of these just pop culture references. Like there's so many memes of Patrick Stewart's Picard, of just the head down and shut up Wesley and the.
But it's funny, isn't it? Because he's obviously been in so much more stuff since that, bigger stuff than that. Like he's Professor X, for God's sake. Like, but all the memes.
He's still Picard.
He's still Picard. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for part 1. Come back in part 2 for the rest of it. And remember, guys, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Bye.
Bye.
Penetrate you.